Mother Bear fell into a trap. When she saw who was lying under it, the forester rushed to help. Winter in Yukon is unlike any other. It isn't just cold, it's a thick, breathless stillness, a white veil covering the entire world, making everything feel as if it has stopped breathing. In that silence lies a humble wooden cabin, hidden among snow-laden pine trees, where Charlotte Kidman lives alone. 55 years old, her silver hair peeks out from under a worn woolen hat. Charlotte has always lived by herself, believing she doesn't need anyone, and no one can make her feel attached anyway. She thought she was best friends with loneliness. But who would have thought that an unexpected encounter with a wild animal might change her point of view forever, might light up her mind, heart, and soul in a way she never thought possible? Before we start, hit the like button and make sure to subscribe if you haven't, and hit that notification bell so that you won't miss any new stories. Charlotte was once a wildlife rescue specialist, having spent decades among injured leopards, deer caught in traps, and baby birds fallen from their nests. But as age crept into her joints and her soul grew weary, she chose to retreat to the north, becoming a forest ranger in a place where humans were nearly non-existent, where life and death sorted themselves out naturally. No one came to her cabin in the winter, and she didn't need anyone. All she wanted was silence. And in that silence, she believed she had learned how to live without any connection at all. Until one morning, when a strange sound pierced through the thick snow, breaking everything she once believed. Charlotte Kidman walked slowly through the heavy snow in the quiet Yukon forest. Pale winter light filtered through the bare trees, casting long shadows on the pristine white ground. Her thick gloves were damp and cold, but she didn't mind. She only meant to be outside briefly, gathering a few dry branches to add to her small cabin supply. A rare day off during the harsh winter, one she had planned to spend reading by the stove. But her legs had pulled her outside, as if part of her still needed to move, to be reminded she was alive. But then she stopped. A sound, low, shaky, hoarse, rose from deep within something's throat. It wasn't the wind nor the creak of frozen trees. Charlotte paused and tilted her head. The sound came again, hesitant, broken, but clearly the cry of a creature in pain. Her instincts as a ranger kicked in immediately. Her seasoned eyes scanned the frozen woods for the slightest movement. Slowly, she moved toward the sound, her hand instinctively resting on the hilt of her survival knife. And then she saw it. A bear. A large female grizzly lying on her side in the snow, trembling all over. Her right hind leg was caught tightly in an old steel trap, a type that had long been banned, though they still sometimes showed up in the forest, left behind by unscrupulous poachers. The trap had bitten deep into her flesh, and the blood had soaked the snow into a dark crimson smear, a heartbreaking sight. Charlotte didn't hesitate. Her heart clenched at the sight of the pain before her, but immediately her caution returned. A wild bear, even injured, is dangerous. If it feels threatened, it could attack. One swipe from its paw could kill. She stepped back slightly, her eyes locked onto the animal, but then her eyes met the bear's. And they weren't full of anger, as she had expected, but of sheer, utter exhaustion. The look of a creature that no longer had the strength to fight, left alone in the frozen world. Beneath the frost-coated gray fur was a body slowly fading with every breath. And when Charlotte leaned in closer, she noticed something that made the scene even more heartbreaking. The bear's belly sagged, a clear sign she was a nursing mother. "Oh God," Charlotte murmured, one hand covering her mouth. What did this mean? It meant that not just one life was in danger. Somewhere in this forest, maybe not far, were bear cubs too young to fend for themselves, waiting for their mother to return. If this bear died here, from blood loss, from cold, or from Charlotte walking away, those cubs would die too. Why had the bear left her den and ended up here? Had it been destroyed? Was it no longer safe? Charlotte clenched her fist. She had lived her life in nature. She had seen tragic things, had stepped in, and had walked away. But this time was different. Maybe it was the look in the bear's eyes, or maybe the quiet, desperate sigh that had escaped from the bear's throat. She knelt beside the animal. "I don't know how much of this you understand," she whispered. "But I'm not going to let you die here." The trap wasn't easy to remove. Charlotte's hands, calloused from years in the wild, still trembled as she gripped the steel jaws. The bear flinched slightly, her ears drawing back as if bracing to defend herself. And Charlotte was forced to pause. "It's okay. Easy now," she whispered, her voice as soft as wind through grass. "I just want to help." With all the strength and care she could muster, Charlotte worked the mechanism. Every time she touched the wounded flesh, the bear's body shuddered, and a hoarse, muffled sound escaped its throat, too weak to be a growl, more like a moan. Finally, with a precise twist and a deep breath, the trap snapped open. Charlotte quickly pulled the injured leg free. Blood rushed out, flowing into the snow in thick streams. Her breath caught in her throat. She unwrapped the scarf from her neck and tied it tightly around the wound to slow the bleeding. "You have to live," she murmured, her voice firmer this time. "Not just for yourself, but for your babies too." She stood, her body aching and her thoughts spinning. She had to get back to the cabin. Should she do more? Could the bear survive? And what if she did? What if she healed and later turned on Charlotte? A soft sound of crunching snow behind her made her turn. The bear, still trembling, still bleeding, was following her, slowly, painfully but surely. Each step was heavy, each movement a struggle. Yet she dragged herself forward, head bowed, eyes fixed on Charlotte. There was no aggression in those eyes, no begging either, just presence, silent and steady. Charlotte stood frozen, heart pounding. "No," she whispered. "You have to go back. I can't let you come with me." But she didn't turn away. She couldn't. It was something her heart wouldn't allow. A lifetime among animals had taught her, sometimes the lines blur, between human and wild, between help and harm. Sometimes a living being, any kind, just needs a hand. Charlotte looked back at the bear. "Can you keep up?" she asked softly. Then she turned and began walking. Step by step, she led the way. And step by painful step, the bear followed. Two creatures, one human, one beast, moving side by side through the frozen woods, saying nothing. Yet bound together by something wordless. Survival. Charlotte woke the next morning to thin rays of sunlight filtering through her frosted window. Snow had fallen again during the night, piling in thick layers on the porch and fence outside. She rubbed her eyes, still heavy from deep sleep, and suddenly noticed something strange. The cabin was too quiet. There was no soft shuffling in the corner where Helen usually lay, no deep, raspy breathing. A sinking feeling spread through her chest. She threw off the covers and rushed to the corner of the room. The old blanket she'd laid down was empty. Helen was gone. A sudden heavy stillness settled around Charlotte. Part of her had known this moment would come, that one day the bear would leave. But not like this, not without a sound, no warning, no parting glance, just silence in a trail of bear tracks leading out into the snow. She stepped outside, gripping the icy railing as she looked toward the forest. The tracks disappeared into the trees. "Take care," she whispered, her lips trembling with cold and something else, a ache in her chest that was harder to explain. She returned inside, lighting the stove and wrapping her hands around a mug of hot tea. But all day long, she couldn't shake the feeling of something missing. The cabin, once a haven of quiet solitude, now felt truly empty. Helen had changed things. Even in just a short time, her presence had filled the room, through the weight of her breathing, the depth of her gaze, the way she nestled into the corner like a child in need of shelter. And now that absence rang loud through every wall and floorboard. As twilight fell, Charlotte lit a candle on the kitchen table and reached for her journal. But before she could write a word, a sound cut through the quiet. A call, low and guttural. A bear's voice, unmistakable, long, muffled, and yearning. Charlotte froze, then rushed to the window. Night had cloaked the woods. Only the moonlight glinted off the snow. Then she saw her, Helen, standing outside the cabin. "Oh my God," Charlotte breathed, opening the door a crack. A blast of cold air hit her face, but what she saw made her forget it completely. Helen wasn't alone. In the shadowy snow behind her stood 4 small figures, bear cubs, fluffy, wobbly-legged, clustered around their mother. They weren't afraid, just quiet, curious, staring at Charlotte with wind-cold black eyes. Charlotte's breath caught in her throat. She had suspected Helen was a mother. She had seen the signs, the sagging belly, the swollen teats, but she had never truly imagined this moment, the bear returning with her cubs. Helen took a step forward, then stopped, her head tilted slightly. Her eyes asked a question. Charlotte looked at her, then at the tiny cubs huddled against the wind. Perhaps their den had collapsed or been discovered by predators. She didn't know, but she saw something in Helen's eyes, something she had seen once before. "Trust. You want to stay?" Charlotte whispered, as though asking an old friend. Helen gave a deep, rumbling sound in reply. Charlotte opened the door wider. The wind howled past her, but so did something else, a strange, warm current. Helen entered first, then one by one her cubs toddled in after her. Their little paws thudded against the wooden floor. Charlotte turned to grab more firewood, her back warmed by the feeling of eyes following her every move. When she turned around again, the 4 cubs were curled into a pile beneath the table. Helen sat beside them, her eyes half closed, her body finally at rest. Charlotte lit a pot of water, set out a little food, and poured herself tea. In her chest, emotions swelled, astonishment, gratitude, awe. No one had ever taught her how to live with bears. But something told her compassion, no matter the species, would always be answered with a miracle. Winter had not yet loosened its grip on Yukon. Snow still blanketed the ground thickly, and sharp winds sliced through the trees like blades. But Charlotte's cabin was no longer just a retreat for one solitary soul. It had become a den, a sanctuary for an entire bear family. Since that unforgettable morning when Helen returned with her cubs, something inside Charlotte had shifted. Without hesitation, but with utmost care, she reorganized the kitchen, moved furniture, laid out extra blankets, dry straw, and even those old cloth sacks she had kept from her years at the wildlife center. The back left corner of the room, close enough to the stove for warmth but distant enough for space, became their temporary den. Charlotte never touched the cubs, not once. Even when they toddled clumsily across the cabin floor, their soft paws making barely a sound on the worn wood, even when they sniffed at the hem of her coat with noses wet and curious, or when they playfully nipped at the frayed leather of her boots like mischievous toddlers testing boundaries, she held her stillness. She never reached out, never indulged the longing to run a hand over their thickening coats or scratch behind their velvety ears. Instead, she let them come and go as they pleased while she remained a quiet fixture in the room, an observer, never an intruder. Every gesture she made was measured, respectful, deliberate, an offering of space more than presence. Each morning, Charlotte woke before dawn to the muted sounds of breathing, soft huffs and rustles, and moved carefully around the cabin. She prepared a bowl of oatmeal, the steam curling upward in lazy spirals, and added a spoonful of honey from the jar she kept hidden away on the top shelf. She always placed the bowl a short distance from the fire, not too close to intrude, not too far to be unreachable. On milder days, she ventured out, wrapped in layers of wool, to gather dried berries still clinging to stubborn winter bushes or strips of edible bark she had learned to recognize. These small offerings weren't hand-fed. She never beckoned them closer, never gave them names, never blurred the sacred line between Helen's cubs and her own human heart. They weren't hers. They belonged to the wild. She knew that. Still, each time she set the bowl down and stepped back, her chest ached with something that felt very close to love. The cubs slept often, as all young animals do, tucked against their mother's great body in a twitching, tangled pile of fur. Charlotte sometimes paused her stitching to simply watch them, the way their tiny paws twitched in dreams, or their ears flicked at phantom sounds. Helen, though the wound in her leg remained visibly swollen, never faltered in her devotion. She nursed them patiently, groomed them with sweeping strokes of her tongue, and kept their small bodies tucked against her side, blanketing them in warmth and calm. Charlotte once witnessed one of the cubs whimper in its sleep, a soft, barely audible cry, and despite her obvious exhaustion, Helen immediately roused herself and nudged the cub closer to her chest, then emitted a low, resonant hum that vibrated through the room like a lullaby no human could ever replicate. A sound ancient and instinctive, a song only bears understand. Charlotte never wrote during those days. Her journal sat closed on the windowsill, collecting a thin layer of dust. But had she picked up her pen, she might have written a single, simple truth: I'm living among the brave souls of the wild. And the most miraculous part is they let me stay. Because deep down, she knew the truth of her role here. This wasn't her home. Not really. The cabin had become a sanctuary, yes, but it didn't belong to her alone anymore. It was borrowed space, temporary ground, shared between two worlds. Helen and her cubs were not pets. They were not guests to be entertained or domesticated. They were wild things, born of snow and instinct. And Charlotte never once forgot that. She didn't play the old records tucked away in her trunk. She kept the overhead lights dim and relied instead on lanterns and firelight. She refrained from sudden movements, loud voices, anything that might blur the edge between her quiet life and their primal rhythms. She avoided eye contact unless Helen offered it. She never tried to teach them, never tried to tame them. She simply lived alongside them, one breath at a time. And slowly, that silence between them became a language of its own. A mutual understanding written not in words but in glances, stillness, and the trust that blooms only when no one demands it. At night, while the wind curled around the cabin like a great animal seeking entry, Charlotte sat in her chair by the hearth, hands steady on the embroidery hoop or wrapped around a mug of hot tea. The fire snapped gently beside her. Behind her, a world breathed in quiet harmony, Helen and her cubs, their bellies rising and falling in rhythm. In those moments, Charlotte understood something rare and profound. That trust doesn't always come from logic. It doesn't arrive with declarations or promises. Sometimes, it's born in a single moment shared between two beings, one who opens a door and one who walks through it, carrying with them winter memory in the fragile beginning of something like hope. Time passed, not in grand events but in the smallest of changes. The rhythm of life slowed to the pace of melting snow. And as winter loosened its grip, the world outside began to shift. The deep white blanket of Yukon began to thin. Gentle rivers returned, carving their paths through ice and memory. Shoots of green emerged in hesitant patches like shy smiles across the forest floor. The air softened, smelled faintly of thawing earth and birch sap. The forest was stirring. One morning, Charlotte stood quietly at the window, watching as morning light filtered through the trees, catching in the newly glistening icicles and painting gold over everything it touched. It fell on Helen too, who now lay with her head raised. Her fur no longer matted but sleek. Her breath slow and steady. Her limp had faded almost entirely. Her body was strong again, whole again. And the cubs, once fragile and clumsy, were now curious, alert, and lean with muscle. They sniffed at the door. They pawed at the wood. Their ears perked at sounds far beyond the clearing. Something was calling them. Charlotte felt it like a tug in her own chest. The wilderness, oh, dear, untamed and ancient, was summoning them home. And Charlotte, standing in her quiet little cabin with one hand pressed against the glass, knew exactly what that meant. It was almost time. 2 months had passed. The cabin, once a refuge for one woman and 4 wild souls, had become something much more. A sanctuary. A resting point in the story of life. Every day, Charlotte had quietly recorded in her heart the little details. The sniffing snout buried in the oatmeal sack. Helen's protective growl when a loud crack split the night. The silent gaze shared between woman and bear by the fire. She never forgot that she was human and Helen was wild. But somewhere between them, something deeply human and deeply bear had been woven, a thread of trust, of mutual presence, of quiet companionship. And now, spring had come. Charlotte stood at the door one morning and opened it wide. The wind had lost its edge. It smelled of thawed earth and pine. Helen stood nearby, her eyes gazing out into the woods. The cubs ran to her, nuzzling restlessly. No words were spoken. No commands were given. But the moment had arrived, a moment where silence was the clearest kind of goodbye. "Go on," Charlotte whispered, though she didn't expect anyone to understand. Helen turned her head one last time. Her gaze met Charlotte's, not cautious, not unsure, simply steady, certain. Charlotte stepped back, giving them space. She said nothing more. Helen moved forward, leading her young into the forest. The 4 cubs tumbled behind her, their chubby paws leaving soft prints in the damp grass, a ribbon of life stretching from winter into spring. At the forest edge, Helen stopped. She looked back one last time, not with fear, not with gratitude, but with understanding, and then she disappeared into the trees. Charlotte remained standing at the doorway for a long while, her fingers resting lightly on the wooden frame, as if afraid that letting go would somehow undo everything that had happened. The wind, gentler now in the early breath of spring, brushed past her cheeks like a memory refusing to fade. In her chest, something stirred, an ache that wasn't sorrow, not quite. It was quieter than grief, deeper than nostalgia. Her heart felt both empty and full, like something precious had been taken, but not in mourning, more like something sacred had been returned to the earth, to where it had always belonged. A chapter completed, a bond released but not severed. Eventually, she stepped back into the cabin and closed the door behind her with a soft click that echoed louder than expected. The space now felt larger, quieter still, but it wasn't a hollow silence. It was the kind that wraps around you gently, like a hand on the shoulder, the kind that carries weight in warmth. There were no more deep breaths in the middle of the night, no low huff of bare lungs stirring the shadows, no watchful eyes glimmering from the corner, no soft scratch of claws on wooden floors just before dawn. Those sounds had filled the cabin for weeks, marking time in their own wild rhythm. Now the emptiness felt strange, like waking from a dream too beautiful to explain. She sat down slowly, her body easing into the old rocking chair with a sigh that mirrored her own. The fire had burned down to glowing embers. She poured herself a cup of tea, and her hands trembled just a little. Not just from the fading chill of morning, but from the gravity of the quiet, from the weight of the memory that had already begun to settle into her bones like the scent of smoke in old wood. In the rising steam of the cup, Charlotte saw Helen again, just as she had been that first day, torn, bleeding, trembling with pain and fear. And then the image shifted to the moment the bear had accepted that first bite of food, hesitant but trusting. The moment she had made that low, unnameable sound, a sound not of hunger or fear, but of something else, something sacred. A murmur of recognition, a call not of desperation but of belonging. As if, in that strange winter-bound miracle, Charlotte had become something more than just a woman with a cabin and a kind heart. She had become part of Helen's story, maybe even part of her family. Now that Helen had returned to the wilderness where she belonged, Charlotte didn't feel regret. She had done what was right, not what was easy, or safe, or comfortable, but right. She hadn't tamed, hadn't taken. She had offered warmth without ownership, shelter without condition, compassion without conquest. She had given a wild creature the one thing the world often failed to offer, a home, a place to simply be. Outside, the snow was melting faster each day. The streams whispered again. The trees had begun to shake off their icy coats. The forest was waking up, and the Yukon, always vast and ancient, sang new melodies now. Songs carried in the babble of water over stone and the tentative chirps of birds returning home. Somewhere in that boundless wilderness, Charlotte imagined the soft footfalls of a bear mother and her 4 cubs weaving through underbrush, curious and alive. She pictured them finding a new den, learning to forage, wrestling beneath shafts of golden spring sun. Maybe, on some quiet afternoon, Charlotte would glance up from her sewing or her tea and see a familiar silhouette standing once more at the edge of the clearing, watching, waiting, remembering. Or maybe not. And that would be all right because Charlotte knew now, in a way she hadn't before, that some bonds don't depend on presence. Some connections, built not from words but from shared breath and silent trust, become part of the land itself. Woven into the falling snow, the footprints in frost, the hush between trees, invisible but permanent. She took another sip of tea, now lukewarm and faintly sweet. And when the fire crackled behind her, it no longer sounded like the noise of an empty cabin. It sounded like a heartbeat.